Hello and a warm welcome from the Global Media Forum in Bonn. Today we are discussing the current peace process in Afghanistan. Just a few days ago, the Afghan president Ashraf Ghani has announced and the Taliban have accepted a 3-day ceasefire for the upcoming Eid holidays that are coming in just in a couple of few days. And this is the very first ceasefire since the fall of the Taliban. And this is something that the former president, Hamid Karzai, did not achieve during his term. He was the one who initiated the peace process in 2010. He set up the Afghanistan High Peace Council, an institution that is charged with establishing peace talks with the Taliban and other insurgent groups. The international community voiced their support repeatedly, but still there were no official talks with the Afghan government. The new US president and the current Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, inherited the Afghan war, as we've seen in the opener. And there are a few new developments. The current US president has intensified pressure on the neighboring country, Pakistan, which Washington and Kabul call the biggest supporter of the Taliban. And the president, Ashraf Ghani, has announced unconditional peace talks and accepting the Taliban as a political group. And this is something that hasn't been done before, but still the peace talks haven't been done so far. They still have been unsuccessful. And our main questions today are: why have the Afghan peace efforts failed so far? Where did the international community go wrong? And finally, which price will the Afghan people pay for a potential peace deal with the Taliban? I'm going to discuss these and other questions with my excellent guests today, and beginning with Hamid Karzai, the former president of Afghanistan. Mr. Karzai led Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. He has been involved in politics. He's still active, very active in the political field, and he is hailed for bringing different Afghan political groups together and form a government. But he has also been criticized for his soft approach towards the Taliban and calling them his brothers. We also have Markus Potzel. He's the federal German special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's representing Germany in the current peace process. He has been a participant of the international peace conferences in the past months. And Mr. Potzel used to be the German ambassador in Kabul from 2014 to 2016. We also have, and I'm also very happy to welcome my colleague Sandra Petersmann, who is an award-winning DW journalist and Asia expert. She traveled to Afghanistan countless times and reported on political issues and women's rights issues. For 5 years, she was the ARD's South Asia correspondent in Delhi, India. And last but not least, we have Huria Musaddiq as our guest. She is the Afghanistan researcher for Amnesty International in London. She has been a civil rights activist for over 20 years and represented Afghanistan on several international donor conferences. Before she turned to activism, she worked as a journalist on the ground. Mr. Karzai, you officially initiated the peace process in 2010, but so far not a single major Taliban group has joined the government in Kabul. Instead, they have been able to be active in 70% of the Afghan territory now. What went wrong?
Thank you, ma'am. I think the original mistake was made in 2001 when the international community gathered in the Bonn conference to bring a solution to the Afghan issue and to create an order there. The Taliban should have been invited to that gathering.
You were part of the conference. Why
No, I was not. I was in Afghanistan. I wish I were. I wasn't there. Subsequent to that, when the US intervened and the international community joined hands, the Afghan people overwhelmingly welcomed the new order. The Taliban gave up power. The Taliban went back to their homes. Peace began in Afghanistan, and what was shown on the television earlier on the screen all happened, truly. What didn't happen was making sure that our neighbor Pakistan stops reliance on extremism as a tool towards neighbors, especially towards Afghanistan.
So you blame Pakistan?
No, not only that. No, it's a bigger picture. It's a bigger picture. And also that the United States went on a revenge type of activity in Afghanistan against the Taliban. They began to attack Afghan homes. They began to take Afghans as prisoners. And this moved many of the Taliban leaders who had settled down in the country to fear for life and to go back to the mountains or to go back to Pakistan. That was the foundation of the return of violence to Afghanistan. Pakistan's inability to accept Afghanistan as a good, peaceful neighbor for their own interests, for the disputes that we had, the Durand Line and all other issues. The United States not paying genuine attention to maintaining peace, rather on hunting down individuals that they thought were against them. These were the fundamental issues that we faced. The Taliban as Afghans, we must be very clear when we refer to the Taliban. The Taliban as Afghans, as individuals, always wanted peace. They were part of their country, part of our soil. So did the Afghan people. The reason that we did not succeed in our peace process so far is fundamentally because the Afghan wish in bringing peace to the country was not the only determining factor.
What were the other factors?
Foreign factors, neighbors, international community, US objectives in the region and Afghanistan, all of those combine hands to deny us peace, which we hope those negative factors are going to go away now. And if that happens, we will certainly sooner have peace.
Mr. Potso, where did the international community fail in all this? What do you think, what could have been done differently?
Well, of course, it's always easy to rejudge the situation as it was back in 2001 from hindsight. At that time, I agree it was a mistake not to involve Taliban, but on the other hand, Taliban were beaten. There were no Taliban left from our perspective. So for us, there was no need to involve Taliban. From today's point of view, of course, they should have been included, and then peace would have been possible. But I have to say, well, first of all, it's an inner Afghan conflict. It's fueled from outside powers, especially Pakistan. I agree. We play a role in that as well. But this conflict, I mean, Afghans are fighting Afghans. So to find a peaceful solution, Afghans have to talk to Afghans. It has to be an Afghan-owned, Afghan-led peace process. We can help facilitate it. True.
Sandra, Mr. Potso said it's an Afghan problem. Do you agree? And what do you have to say about this?
Well, I would agree with President Karzai that there are a lot of external factors, but I would also like to take you back to October 2001 when the bombing campaign of the American-led invasion started. At that time, we were also looking at a civil war in Afghanistan. It was not that Afghanistan back then was a peaceful country. And that civil war, till today, is somewhat still a layer of the conflict. There have been additional layers added and added and added. So now we have a very crowded battlefield in Afghanistan. But essentially, I mean, you just have to look at the government of national unity. I would rather call it the government of national disunity, because I don't see a lot of unity in this government. So those internal forces, I think, are very much a part of this conflict, are making the conflict worse. And even if we would pull out all troops now, and even if Pakistan were a neighbor accepting Afghanistan as a peaceful country, I'm not entirely sure that we would see peace in Afghanistan immediately, because there are still competing forces. And yes, Mr. President, I think with the United States and other international actors, you know, coming into the country, they chose their own proxies, so to say. You know, Germany picked one, America picked one. There was a division within the country. And to bring all those forces together for an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned
So
peace
does it
deal,
play
I think that's a long way to go.
So do you think, given the fact that there are so many countries involved in this conflict, does it play a role that the Taliban have rejected to talk to the Afghan government because they don't see them as an independent government? They only have said they want to talk to the US. Does this play a crucial role?
I think maybe it's not so much seeing them as an independent government, but as an illegitimate government, because as we have rightly pointed out, they weren't part of the whole Bonn process, though there might have been a period of time, remind me, Mr. President, there was an offer which back then was rejected by Cheney and Rumsfeld, from what I know.
Yes,
and
right.
so, yeah, they were not part of the Bonn process, and ever since, I think the Islamic Emirate still regards itself as a legitimate force for Afghanistan, while saying that the present government is an illegitimate force, which is, you know, at the helm of Afghanistan because of the United States, mainly.
Mrs. Mossadegh, one thing we haven't talked about so far is the human rights organization that have been voiced their concern over and over again, and they have been criticizing that Afghan women are not part of this peace process. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, before I highlight your question, I would like to make a few remarks in what Mr. Karzai and other fellow speakers have spoken. I do agree with you that Bonn Conference was a mistake. Why it was a mistake? Because what happened, the world came with a definition of good human rights abusers and bad human rights abusers. Good human rights abusers were the ones who allied with the US to fight the Taliban, and bad human rights abusers were the Taliban who were committing
So you mean the groups that committed war crimes in Afghanistan?
Definitely, yeah. And second, I think the solution for Afghanistan was not to parachute a government with a president from another place. They should have gone with an example of Kosovo. The country could have been administered by the UN. They could have gone through accountability to the past human rights violations. Anyone who committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and massive human rights violations, they should have been brought to justice. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And if we see at the peace negotiations in Afghanistan history, from back 1980s, when I was a teenager, I remember when Benin 7 tried to break a peace, when there were different other efforts by the international community, including the US, including the Russia, to bring peace in Afghanistan. And do you know why every time those peace agreements have failed? Do you know why every time, even providing I would say immunity or general amnesty that failed? Because we try to bypass justice.
So if we have a look at the ongoing peace process, do you think that a possible peace deal would mean that we would have to let go of the immunity of the accountability that human rights organizations have been calling for?
Well, I do believe that there is no shortcut to peace. If we do not address justice, if we do not hold people into account, we will have a circle of violence that will go on and on and on. And we are seeing that in the past 40 years in Afghanistan. And this is unfortunately what is being happening. And also, I think I would agree with Mr. Ambassador who said Taliban didn't leave. They were forced to leave. They were under attack. They couldn't afford to stand because Pakistan allied itself with the US for many other reasons, and they pulled their support from the Taliban, and it resulted in Taliban collapse.
Yes, we will come back to that later, but I want to focus on Afghan women because we shouldn't keep them out of this discussion as well.
Definitely, I would come to that. I think even if you see in the past 40 years, Afghan women have been losing and losing on and on. We were used as political image, even if it was during communist era. It was always women with their short skirts who would sit at the front seats. But where were the women's rights? Unfortunately, it wasn't there. And even now, when we look at when the US and West tried to justify their attack on Taliban, the image that was on and on shown on international TVs was a woman being shot dead in Afghan stadium, in Kabul stadium. Let's liberate Afghan women. How liberate Afghan women has become, unfortunately, not really much.
In fact, Afghan women were a tool to justify the war in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and this was also to justify the war and to create support among their own citizens, because there wasn't any kind of appetite among the international community to go into another war. And second, when we look at the peace negotiation, unfortunately, in the past few years, women are simply being a kind of sidelined from the peace negotiations. Why? For example, in Maldives peace process, Taliban strictly forbidden presence of women. They said we will not sit on a table where women are presented. Second, none of these women are really at the decision-making level at the High Peace Council. Often these peace deals are done with a bunch of a kind of big guys with bushy beards or gray hairs.
I think this was also the case when Mr. Karzai initiated the peace process. Mr. Karzai, what do you think is different this time? President Ghani has announced a ceasefire. He offered unconditional talks. He even offered to negotiate the Afghan constitution, something Afghan people are very proud of since its implementation in 2001. What is different?
Well, the announcement of ceasefire, unilateral ceasefire by the Afghan government is a good step. And it's a good step also because now more of the country is in the hands of the Taliban. The BBC reported 70% of the country either directly under the Taliban or influenced by the Taliban. So that means the Taliban have now large territory and population with them. The Taliban responded by accepting a 3-day ceasefire during Eid.
But they killed 15 policemen yesterday.
Yes, unfortunately. Unfortunately, both sides shouldn't do that. Both sides. Neither should the government attack villages in the name of fighting the Taliban, nor the Taliban. Even if it is 3 days, we are happy. We welcome it. And we hope that the 3 days will somehow eventually be extended to a permanent ceasefire and peace in Afghanistan. But I must come back to my original point. Our colleague said that the fight is Afghan, so did Ambassador Purcell. The fight is not Afghan. In this fight, the Afghans are dying. It isn't Afghan fight. It isn't for the interests of Afghanistan. It's somebody else's fight in which we die, the Afghan people. It's the US objectives in Afghanistan and the broader region. It's the Pakistani dispute with us and their own hegemonic agendas vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And this began 40 years ago during the Cold War, in the bitter rivalry between the West and the Eastern Bloc. The consequences have been falling on us till today. Therefore, in a fight in which the Afghans are dying for the cause or the interests of others, we hope that we will have an arrangement where all the stakeholders, the US, Pakistan, the bigger region, and the Afghans will reach an accommodation that will be good for all. That's a long shot, but that's something worth working for.
Mr. Purcell, so Mr. Karzai is saying that this war is imposed on Afghans. You're saying this is an Afghan war. So how can the international community help to improve the situation?
I have a lot of respect for President Karzai, definitely. But at this point, I disagree, because I think it's an inner-Afghan conflict. And the reason, I mean, it has been going on for more than 40 years, as you said, rightly said. But the main reason is that the state structures in Afghanistan are very weak. They've been weak for centuries, you have to say. And if you don't have a state who reaches out to the remote areas, providing services, legal services, health services, education, and security, most of all security, a state has the obligation to keep their own citizens secure. And that's a point that the Afghan government cannot guarantee at the moment. That's why we have to enable
the international community, your government have paid these people to be in power.
We have to enable the government to guarantee their own citizen security. And that's why we have now this condition-based approach. We say we stay in this country as long as it's necessary to secure its citizens, Afghan citizens. But we want the Afghan government to do that. We try to enable the Afghan government. We support the security forces, we train them, we advise them.
Exactly.
And
you are supporting government officials who are accused of committing war crimes. So how are you justifying this?
No, we are not supporting war criminals. We are supporting
They're
a government
accused
which
of
is
committing war crimes.
a legitimate government government, a government which was the result of elections, and there will be fresh elections next year, presidential elections, parliamentary elections this year. So the Afghan population can decide which sort of government they want, and we continue to support the government and the Afghan people, of course.
You want to add something?
To a good conversation. Ambassador Purcell, Afghanistan was a much poorer country in the 1970s and 60s, but one of the most peaceful countries in the world. Afghanistan's government at that time was much weaker in terms of the tools at hand than we have today. But it was massively legitimate, and the Afghan people supported it. The services in the countryside were not even 1% of what we have today. But the people accepted the government as theirs. So it isn't the question of services and all that. It's the question of belonging, ownership, a sense that things are ours. Today, things are not ours. If things were ours, how come John Kerry came to Kabul in 2014 to raise two hands, make one the president, the other the chief executive? What business did he have to doing that? You remember in the 2009 elections in Afghanistan, when I was the candidate, the Americans came and asked me to do the same thing, have a chief executive. When I said no, they said, well, you have lost it.
But Mr. Karzai, I have to read in, and I have to say that there were the same accusations against you because you were installed by the United States in Afghanistan.
In 2001?
You were in power. And yes, you were installed.
In 2001, yes, I was installed by
in
the United States and the Bonn process, but the Afghan people accepted it. That was a particular situation where the Taliban were defeated. The international community, the entirety of the international community came on board. Iran was on board, an opponent of the US. Russia was on board, had a lot of differences with the US. China was on board, the Saudis were on board, and the Afghan people accepted that arrangement. We all did. And then that arrangement was endorsed by the emergency law Jarga subsequently in 6 months. And within 2 years, we had our constitution and the elections that came as a result. So the Afghans accepted the new order. But in the new order, something terrible happened by our international friends. Around 2003-04, when the country was in complete peace already, one day I was reading maybe the New York Times or one of these other American or British papers saying that Karzai is the mayor of Kabul.
Do you agree?
No, I didn't agree then. I don't agree now. It was said at a time when the Afghan flag was flying all over the country. And I could go into a vehicle and drive to any part of the country, and I did. Was this a lack of information in the Western media? Or was this a calculated announcement or propaganda towards an eventual objective in Afghanistan?
Ms. Mossadegh, do you agree to this? Do you think there was enough support from the Afghan population, even the rural population?
Unfortunately, Afghans were not given enough options. We were caught between bad and worse. Like I would always say, like, you're hurried to go somewhere and you have 5 dirty shirts. You choose the less dirty one. And unfortunately, this is what happened to the Afghan people. I'm very honest. And second, Mr. President, between 2002 and 2004, you have neglected Afghanistan. You have allowed your own officials across the country to go and commit massive human rights violations, and you closed eyes to what was happening. I was in Helmand. I was in Kandahar. I went to the, as you mentioned, I was traveling all around the country, and I am hearing the cries of people, please tell Mr. Karzai to stop their officials. Your governors in Helmand, in Kandahar, in Uruzgan, in Zabul, in many other places, they were involved not only in illegal trades, but also they were involved in massive human rights violations. Yes, exactly. They were not going only after the Taliban, but they were also going after their own tribal and political opponents. And they were putting them into background, they were putting them into Guantanamo, And we kept on and on. I met with Mr. Sayyid Jawad. I met with Mr. Jawid Ludin on that time. And I raised the alarm and I raised the bill that if nothing is happening, we will see much more chaos.
Do you want to comment on that, Mr. Karzai?
Unfortunately, nothing happened.
No. Look, let's take the case of Helmand. Was Helmand better off with Mullah Shir Mahmud Akhundzada as the governor at that time? Or was it better off when the British and the Americans insisted that I remove him, and within 2 months the whole Helmand went back to the Taliban? Which one was better off?
I agree that under Mullah Shir Mahmud it was peaceful. But at the same time, I think it was... I can agree with you, but at the same time, I think there were... I think there were many things that went wrong to lead us to the current situation.
Yes, many things went wrong. We had just begun. For us, the priority was stability and security. We had both of that. And at that time, 170,000 boys and girls went to school. Within 6 months after that, when the British arrived, together with the Americans, the entire school system collapsed. And we didn't even have 5,000 girls in schools or boys. So we were right, and we were doing the right thing.
Yes, and we do see the situation worsening right now. So what can the international community do, Sandra Petersmann? Don't you think that a possible peace deal and possible Taliban in the Afghan government could make a very difficult situation for the international community? How will they justify cooperating with the Afghan government? How will they justify giving aid to the Afghan government?
I would like to hear Markus Potzel's answers to that, but to share my opinion with you, I think first of all what it takes would be an acknowledgement of failure on the side of the international community. We have seen it partly coming from Norway, who basically in their report at the bottom line said, look, the only thing we could prove in Afghanistan is that we were a good NATO ally. But that was about everything we achieved there. I think that is still lacking from other international actors, including Germany, I may say. But it would also take, I think, Mr. President, acknowledgement from the competing Afghan forces to acknowledge where they went wrong. Because I would insist, yes, there are international factors, but there are also national factors.
Sure,
it's not that the Afghans who are on the playing field now are all puppets on the strings from Pakistan, India, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia. No, they have their very own interests.
Of course.
Some of them are criminal interests, some of them are political, power-thirsty interests, you know. It's not that, you know, if we would take all international actors out, peace would prevail in Afghanistan. I really think that's a long way off because essentially we do have an internal conflict in Afghanistan that is spurred, I agree with you very much, by international factors who have aggravated it. Also, when we keep talking about the Taliban, I think it's not a static force. The Taliban, you know, 2001, very different from the kind of forces that we see now because ideological factors may have changed. We have an insurgency that is triggered by what Mr. Karzai so violently opposed, the night raids, the airstrikes that hit civilians, you know, that pulled a lot of young fighters.
But do you think the ideology about Afghan women will change or has changed? Will Afghan women be still be able to go to school?
Well, we see that more and more Afghan girls do not go to school. We have Taliban openly threatening girls' schools. We have seen it in Nangarhar from, you know, so-called IS, which we haven't even mentioned yet, you know, that you have a more fractured Islamist insurgency in Afghanistan these days. So I think if we are really open and honest, women's rights are not the issue right now. They may have been used at the beginning to justify the war, but today I don't think that they play a very huge role in the discussion.
Very true.
Mr. Potzel, so will the German government be able to justify working together with an Afghan government that includes Taliban?
Well, first of all, we have to say that the peace process hasn't started yet. I mean, we have to find
but we can still dream about it. So.
No, we're not only dreaming about it, we are working. We are working to find an entry point into peace talks, which is hard enough, actually. Of course, we have to talk to, and the Afghan government has to talk to the Taliban and vice versa. And of course, the international community plays a role in that. And we are a party to the conflict, no doubt about that. That's why we have to play a role in a peace process to come. But let me draw our attention, your attention, also to a fact which has been neglected also by the international community for far too long. It's the war economy. Now we have to change the mindset of people who profit from that war. And as long as people continue to profit from that, why should they have an interest in stopping the conflict? And it's we have to create or we have to promote private business. We have to we have to show young people, especially young people, perspectives to stay in the country and to set up their own business and to have an economic perspective.
I will come back to that later. Mr. Karzai, do you think that with the new US president intensifying pressure on the neighboring country, Pakistan, the dynamics have changed?
I think there were two very good remarks made by your two respective panelists. One was that the international community must admit, frankly, the failures that they have committed or happened under their watch. Second, that we must address the war economy, which is truly the case. Both are unfortunately the product of outside presence in Afghanistan. We Afghans, of course, you're very right, have our own responsibilities. It's our country. At the end of the day, nothing will happen unless Afghans decide for the good towards our country. But the overwhelming force from outside, from the Soviet Union to the US, to NATO, to neighbors, is something that a small nation like Afghanistan has no way of addressing and overcoming.
But you have been pointing fingers at Pakistan, even today.
Yes.
That's what you do.
Yes.
So,
yes, in two specific ways. One, when the Afghan people began to resist the former Soviet Union, when we began to fight for our liberation against the Soviet invasion,
with the help of the Americans?
With the help of the Americans and from a base in Pakistan, a fundamental thing went wrong. That was that the Americans, their allies in the Arab world, and the Pakistanis began to use religion as an instrument to defeat communism and the Soviet Union. This was a massive plan of financial and military and ideological indoctrination in Afghanistan in order to defeat the Soviet Union, with immense consequences for the Afghan people. All the extremists from around the world were brought to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And when the Soviets left, this tool of extremism was readily already within the hands of Pakistan and available. And they continued to use it against Afghanistan, the Taliban, and others were a result of that. In 2001, when we began afresh with America, we hoped very much as a nation that the Americans would not do that now, and that Pakistan would be completely stopped, and Americans had the power over Pakistan then to do that. China was not that big at the time with the Pakistanis, and Pakistan was alone and isolated. That didn't happen. We saw, unfortunately, again, that the Americans and the Pakistanis had plenty of hobnobbing on things between them, including the support to extremism from Pakistan and including the neglect of that by the United States of America. So the consequences on us. Therefore, it is very right, as Madame said, that the West, or in other words, the world, as is present in Afghanistan, must take responsibility for the wrongdoings and the mistakes. And second, we, the Afghan people, must take more ownership of our own affairs vis-a-vis the outside world.
You still haven't answered my question. What about Pakistan? Are the dynamics changing?
It in those long terms, you know.
Are things changing right now with U.S. President Donald Trump?
I don't see any pressure from the Americans on Pakistan yet.
You don't see any
I've
pressure.
heard talk. I've not seen action, no.
Mr. Potzel, how difficult is it to create consensus when you have so many stakeholders in this peace process?
It has become more difficult over the last 17 years, definitely. I agree with President Karzai that a lot of outside powers playing into that conflict. It's a proxy battlefield. You know, we have the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. You have the conflict between Russia and NATO. You have, of course, the conflict between India and Pakistan, and also India with China. Now a new conflict plays into it. It's Qatar on the one hand and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates on the other hand. It's a very, very complex conflict, and the more complicated it gets, the more difficult it will be to solve it. But one remark on President Karzai's statement. I think the Americans are putting a lot of pressure on Pakistan these days. They have withdrawn, I mean, they have suspended military aid, and they're putting us as well. We are putting diplomatic pressure on Pakistan. I myself, I went to Pakistan 3 times during the last half year. I talked to not only the civilian government, which is our main partner, but it's of course also the military leadership, which wields the power in the country. We have to face it, you know. And we're talking a lot. We are pressurizing them. But for Pakistan, Afghanistan is a strategic issue, you know, vis-à-vis India. They use Afghanistan or terrorist groups in Afghanistan as a bargaining chip, as a leverage against India. And unless that stops, it's very difficult to...
How do you assess the situation? You've been traveling to Pakistan many times, Sandra.
Yeah, well, Pakistan, of course, I would say we really have to look at the Indian-Pakistan conflict here to understand why Pakistan is trying to, you know, destabilize Afghanistan, because it's the deep theory, you know, for in case there is an attack by India, they want to use Afghanistan as another battlefield, so to say. But I wouldn't say that Pakistan is the only problem. It's a big problem, but it's not the only problem. And sometimes I feel that, you know, whenever something goes wrong in Afghanistan, blame it on Pakistan. It's that constant finger pointing, which I think, as crucial as the problem is, it doesn't really bring us any further towards a peace deal. So again, I would suggest that if we really want to look at an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process, Afghans themselves need to come to terms with each other. What you have said is very right. There is a complete absence of rule of law. There is a complete absence of reconciliation. We have war crimes perpetrators in government, in parliament. And what does that do to the victims? Maybe that is also a factor driving you know, citizens of Afghanistan into the arms of more radical extremist forces.
To add a positive note, there are signs of hope. There are visits from Pakistan to Afghanistan today. The Chief of Army Staff, Abashwa, is due to arrive in Kabul again. And there's this Afghanistan-Pakistan plan of action and peace and solidarity. There are good moves at the moment on the ground.
Ms. Mossadegh, I want to come back to the real victims of the Afghan war, the Afghan people, and also Sandra pointed out their responsibility. We know, according to the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, that around 760 people have been killed so far from January to March, and it looks like this year could be the bloodiest year since the fall of the Taliban. So what do you think? What will happen to the Afghan population if there is a peace deal? How could they benefit from it, and what will they lose?
Yeah, well, again, I agree with Mr. Ambassador, which said that peace process even haven't started in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And I do agree with Mr. President that there are so many internal and external factors associated with that. But at the same time, I think I do believe that unfortunately, in the past 40 years, it's Afghan people who are losing on and on. Mm-hmm. And they have been betrayed on and on. Exactly. They are betrayed by their own governments. They are betrayed by the international community. They are betrayed by everyone who raised a hand to help them. Unfortunately, they just helped themselves. And the only thing that didn't get help is Afghan people. Right. And in terms of period of jihad, it wasn't only Saudi, Iran, or Pakistan that were glorifying jihad under the name of Islam. It was USA, it was the West. I still remember the US ambassador in Pakistan which said, let's go and do jihad because Islam is under danger. I still have those textbooks which are saying, my father killed 2 Russians, my brother killed 2 communists, 2 + 4 is equal to 4 infidels. And that was educated and that was taught to the students of year 1 and 2 in Peshawar camps. I think so many things went wrong in Afghanistan. So many things went wrong in Afghanistan.
How can we protect human rights now?
I think the only way is accountability. If we don't have rule of law, if we don't have accountability to the past human rights abuses, if we don't have accountability to the war crimes that keep committing, we will have much wider circle that will happen in future. And unfortunately, it is just circulating. Mr. President said till 2004, the situation was peaceful. I totally agree with you. But what went wrong in 2005? Because many of those perpetrators who are supposed to be behind bars, they were brought into positions of power under Mr. President, and they also brought into the Afghan parliament.
Mr. Karzai, so what do you want to comment on this? Because
Look,
these are some harsh accusations against you.
No, it's fine.
He accepts.
You see, the rule of law will not come unless we have peace. You cannot implement rule of law either in the absence of peace or in the presence of foreign forces. We saw that firsthand. Afghanistan needs a new compact within ourselves and with our international partners. Therefore, there has to be a twofold process. The Taliban and the rest of Afghanistan must sit down and talk as Afghans. Whatever you call them, warlords, human rights violators, all of them have some segment of the population with them. You know that. So when they have a segment of the population with them, they are a fact of life for us.
I think we have to leave it here because
we
still
can't
have...
leave it here just a second. We have a proposal to make. The second part is the international part. Let us begin a dialogue among Afghans, and let us then take that dialogue back to Bonn, to a third Bonn, where the international community will guarantee non-interference into Afghanistan from the region and the neighborhood, where the Afghans will give guarantees to our neighbors, especially Pakistan, that our soil will not be used against them. But with guarantees back from Pakistan that their soil will not be used against us either, and that the Americans and our other partners will behave differently in Afghanistan and stay happily afterwards. Or if they wish to leave, they may leave.
Mr. Potzel, do you think that a third Bonn conference is possible?
I couldn't agree more. Bonn 3 could be at the end of a peace process. Exactly, but we have to keep in mind that we have to include Taliban in the peace process, and we do not know yet what they want. They should come out in the open to say what do they want. Do they want to have a share in power? Do they want to be part of the government? Do they want to stay outside the government? There have to be compromises, no doubt about that. How should they look like? I mean, I don't think we should compromise on human rights and women's rights. I don't think we should compromise on supporting terrorist groups. We shouldn't compromise on violence. There should be an end of violence. Otherwise, there can't be peace, of course.
I think there's a consensus when it comes to this. And I want all the panelists to weigh in on a topic that has been keeping German politicians quite busy in recent years, Afghan refugees and their deportation to Afghanistan. And we will make a very short round. How could peace with the Taliban impact Afghan asylum seekers here in Germany? Let's start with Mr. Karzai.
Peace with the Taliban and the return of peace to Afghanistan and a government chosen by the Afghan people would impact very positively on the stability of Afghanistan, where Afghans will not leave the country, and those who are hoping will come back. Look, we saw this from 2002 to 2013, 14. People from outside of Afghanistan who had migrated were coming back to Afghanistan. Millions returned from Pakistan, millions returned from Iran, and thousands returned from Europe and America back to Afghanistan.
Sandro, could this happen again?
It was after 2014 when lots of propaganda was launched against Afghanistan, if you remember the Western media, In 2014, when the Americans leave, Afghanistan will be hell. Afghanistan will be destroyed. Afghanistan will be this. Look, there was a massive psychological war against the Afghan people that led to massive migration from Afghanistan, ending up in Germany and the rest of it, and also the way the Americans managed our elections and the creation of the government.
Sandra, could this happen again? And please keep it short.
Keep it short, yeah. Well, as a journalist back then in 2002, we reported on the massive influx of people coming to Afghanistan because they thought we get our home country back.
Yes.
And then, as Mr. President said, we saw a massive migration, a massive, refugee crisis, if you want to call it that, mainly going towards Europe. And yes, that can happen again. Because what people in Afghanistan are essentially lacking is security and peace. Only then can you start to live your life, can you start to open up shops, can you start to move around the country. I was in a position to travel from Kabul to Kunduz by car.
That is impossible
Easily.
today.
It is impossible.
Today, I think my bosses would bar me from leaving Kabul unless I probably embed myself with the German army.
Ms. Mossadegh, what do you think? Will a possible Afghan peace deal affect asylum seekers here in Germany?
Well, I think definitely it will, because as all the fellow speakers have pointed, if we have a secure country, if we have peace, if we have economic infrastructures in place, people wouldn't leave. They are not coming here because they love Germany or they love Europe. They are coming because they want to seek shelter from what is happening on daily basis on the streets and villages of Afghanistan. Just yesterday, an attack in Kabul Ministry of Rural Development has killed so many lives, and among them Shamila Barekzai, a very talented young Afghan woman that was killed. She had a whole future in front of her. And many people seeing that, and they don't want to get killed.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Potzel, you are the ones who is killing our dreams, and you're saying that a peace deal is far away. So will there be more deportations to Afghanistan?
I think, the number of Afghans coming to Germany, to Europe, has decreased tremendously over the past years, 2 years probably, because I think people do not believe the lies of human traffickers anymore. Life in Germany is not a bed of roses. I mean, it's far different from Afghanistan. It's secure, of course, and we are prosperous. But I think Afghans want to live in their own country. And I think if we can achieve peace in Afghanistan, a lot of people will go back. And also people who can invest in Afghanistan, take the money back and set up their own businesses there. I think that's very important.
So with this, I will end this program here. I want to thank my guests for being here, for taking their time, for traveling to Bonn and being a part of the Global Media Forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank the wonderful audience for being here, for taking part and being so attentive. And also thank you to our viewers. Thank you.
Very good. Very good.
So we're not finished. I need my microphone. We probably still have questions from the audience. We're not recording anymore, but if you want to pose questions, I think we have 5 minutes. We have one question here, one question over there.
On a German film? I remember.
Yeah. So please, can we get microphones?
Sandra, I think
Mr. President, we still have questions from the audience.
Oh, I see.
I give you the mic.
Okay.